Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, and I'd like to present him. As per Google, and you have to go to Google, it's the Ministry of Truth, pravda.com. Ricardo Duchesne is a Puerto Rican-born Canadian historical sociobiologist and former professor at the University of New Brunswick. His main research interests are Western civilization, the rise of the West, and multiculturalism. And it lists a number of books here: Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. Dr. Ricardo, you're very welcome to this podcast.
Hello, Bitwix. It's good to be here, and we can have a good discussion.
Okay, so I shall begin by asking you, Ricardo, how did you reach your current worldview? And did it take you a long time to get to this general perspective, or was it of, I don't know, in the last decade or so?
Yeah, I would say it was in the last decade that I really started to realize that the Western world was engaged in this program for diversification via mass immigration. I had some idea about that, and I knew way back in the early 1990s that the borders in Canada had been set wide open at that time. But although it made me uneasy, even though when I was on the left, I didn't think too much about it because I inhabited leftist worldview through my undergraduate and my graduate and PhD and the first decade of my teaching. I had a leftist worldview. So it was only around, I would say, 2004 that I started realizing there was something fundamentally wrong with the leftist worldview. And from there, it was a slow, gradual process of escaping this worldview, which is not easy because when you're educated in that worldview and you have read, and that's how you conceptualize reality, it's almost as if your brain is wired in that direction. So it was, at least for me, quite hard to overcome that leftist worldview. And so from 2004, perhaps earlier, in fact, earlier, because I started being concerned about Western civilization in the late 1990s. And the left is not concerned with Western civilization and the achievements of the West. So you could say that I was already moving away from the left in the late 90s, but still, in many ways, my thinking was framed by a leftist worldview. I was kind of thinking, well, we need to make the academics around and leftists to appreciate Western civilization. I saw that that was possible if you engage with them in a rational way. So it was really around 2004 where I kind of realized, no, this goes deeper. The left cannot overcome this dislike of the West. From there, I mean, I'm still developing intellectually. In a way, I've been almost through every current of thought because I generally like to give every viewpoint their own space within my mind, to give it a hear, to consider its best arguments. So I wasn't a person that really read or was keen on school when I was in high school. It was only when I got out of high school that I started thinking about politics. And at that point, I would say I was a third world Marxist, into the Cuban Revolution, various guerrilla movements in Latin America, and things like that, and Soviet Marxism. I like the Soviet Union. Then I moved into a more Western Marxist conception. I became critical of the way in which in the Soviet Union and other communist nations. There was this big bureaucratic power in charge of society rather than real workers, state, and representative, a collective of workers that actually controls and organizes production. So I move into a more Western Marxist viewpoint, reading many Marxist thinkers from England, France, and so on. And then I would say I started moving more into a liberal viewpoint. I began to read liberals and started taking seriously the arguments about freedom of the press, my sense that capitalism or a market economy was essential for the rational allocation of scarce resources. I accepted that argument. I became very critical of centralized planning of the economy. And so I remain a sort of leftist liberal. I got a bit into postmodernism. This is like early 1990s. And into the mid 1990s, and then slightly more critical of this perspective into soft conservative viewpoint by the late 1990s. And then by the, as I was saying before, I knew there was something then fundamentally wrong in our society, in the fact that they were pushing for diversity and many other leftist ideas. And so I kind of remain a liberal in the sense that liberalism is a viewpoint that surrounds us from every direction. And even when you think you're critical of it, you really are not. For example, conservatives, now we know they are liberals. They just happen to be liberals from an older generation, or liberals with ideas from an older generation. So I was still a liberal in that sense. And by 2000, as I said before, 2013 is when I began to think about race. And I think that at that point is when you start really moving beyond conservatism. You start moving into what we call now the dissident right. And yet in a kind of what may seem to some people odd way, I still remain a liberal. And I think many people in the dissident right are liberals, even though they don't know it. I have sometimes said that race realism is still a liberal perspective, but that's more complicated than just saying this. So only now, since last year, actually, as recent as last year, have I finally began to understand liberalism in a deeper way and to be critical of it in a more fundamental way. So that's what I would say, yes.
All right, yeah. I think I first came across your good self. It was a number of years ago. Were you on Red Ice Radio at some stage?
Oh yes, I was in Red Ice about 4 or 5 times. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there was one video, and you were talking about, what makes white people different and the societies they create. And if I remember correctly, you were saying that whites, they're very creative. They like tinkering around with things. They do things that are not, economically viable. For example, they might, as a hobby, grow some vegetables. Not to make money, not to make lots of money, just to do it for the novelty of doing it. And I notice, as where I am, Spain becomes more and more multicultural, you're getting less a sense of what it is to be a European. And I think a good example is I noticed that on certain streets, whites are, a serious minority on certain streets. They could be 10% of the pedestrians. And on these streets, you'll come across a secondhand bookshop, for example. And when you go in there, there is no diversity. It's some old white guy behind the counter, and you might have 2 or 3 customers in there browsing through these old books, and they all happen to be Europeans. it's kind of like, you know, the vampire can't enter the bookshop. And, you know, in time, you know, that bookshop's going to become a Foot Locker or a mobile phone shop or a kebab shop.
Yes.
And this is the thing about diversity. It actually destroys diversity. You know, you won't have a tea shop. You won't have a bookshop. You won't have a lot of things that we have at the moment. And I want to say as well, you mentioned Latin America. Have you traveled extensively across Latin America?
No, actually, let me see. I haven't been anywhere except Puerto Rico. That's it. Not even Mexico.
Okay, right. And do you speak Spanish?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, no, I noticed that I visited Brazil once, and I noticed in São Paulo and they're kind of they're suburbs, but really they're cities in and of themselves around São Paulo. You have a multicultural society, and it seems to be a caste system. So you could go down one street and it's very clean. You have nice cafes, and it's predominantly people of European extraction, some mestizos, etc. And when you go around the corner, you're suddenly in a shanty town. And these are populated mostly by people of sub-Saharan African origin. And even though the governments, they try to help, you know, the underprivileged, etc., so they say anyway, you still have this system where the clean streets, generally it's a European population, you know, the poorest of the poor, it's generally people of sub-Saharan African extraction. So we're starting to see this in Europe now. In fact, as I speak, the first shanty town has appeared in Dublin, in Ireland, and people are completely perplexed. How could this happen? How could a shanty town appear in a modern European city like Dublin?
Yes. To add to, you asked me or mentioned white peculiarities of the white race. My path in the direction away from the left came along with this interest that I had in Western civilization. There is a big debate. It's the biggest debate in world history, which is why the Western civilization take the historical trajectory that it took so different. Some people reduce that to why did it industrialize first, and together with that, why the West developed modern Newtonian science. In my book Uniqueness, I took it beyond that, and I argue that the West has always been very different since actually prehistoric Indo-Europeans. I identified already in their lifestyle of the Indo-Europeans preceding the ancient Greeks certain attributes that are unique to whites, one of which I said was their aristocratic culture, which means that you did not have a despot, one ruler dominating everything, and then the aristocracy is still subservient. Even though you call it aristocracy, it is actually subservient in many Asian, India, the Americas, Africa. That was the case. Whereas in the West, there was that sense of aristocratic liberty very early on in its history. And there were many other attributes that you can see among Indo-Europeans. And then once you get to ancient Greece, you see an explosion of knowledge. You see the invention of philosophical thinking and rationalism, deductive geometry, citizenship democracy. That is, those who are citizens participate directly in the conduct of politics, and other things like literary forms that you don't find in other societies, tragedy, lyric poetry, prose writing itself was an invention of the Greeks. And then you go beyond that and you see other novelties by the ancient Romans, their legal system that everyone talks about. and so on. So I argue that Western peoples have always been very creative from very early on in their history. But I didn't think in terms of race. Even in my book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, which was published in 2011, I avoided the concept of race. It was only in later on, after 2012, 2013, that I started realizing that the West is a civilization that is very closely tied to a race, the white race, or the European race. So I started reading about this. It was very new to me, totally new. In the academic world, you just don't read about race unless you're criticizing the white race and celebrating other races. So the academic world is a very kind of contradictory environment in that respect, because they're obsessed with race, but at the same time they tell you that races don't exist, but blacks do exist, and Asians do exist, and natives do exist, and whites do exist when you identify negative attributes about them, but not if you say anything positive. Then they will say, what is the white race? Even Jordan Peterson says things like that. Anytime you say anything positive, he says, well, how do we know what white is? He says. So I started thinking about race in a consistent, serious way by reading the people that are good at analyzing the idea of race. And so in doing that, I started digging deeper into other attributes about whites. And I will say that one of the best books recently, that has come out recently in 2020, is the one by Joseph Henrich, The Weirdest People. That's the title. And he, through a very long argument, he shows, he doesn't use the word white. He says Western peoples, but we know they're white, have a very peculiar, that's why he says weird, because in no other nation, among no other people, do you find these attributes, this psychological disposition. And by the way, Kevin McDonald also made a somewhat similar argument in his book, and I wrote a long review about his book. It's called Liberalism and the Liberal, no, Individualism and the Liberal Tradition, the book by Kevin McDonald, which I review. I also wrote a long review of Joseph Henry's book. So taking those two books combined, you see that whites have certain attributes that go back very early on in their history. And in those two reviews that I wrote, you can see that I, bring all my own ideas about this. But in any case, let's just quickly go over those peculiar white attributes, because you were mentioning a bookstore that, you only see Europeans inside those bookstores. Well, according to Heinrich, you see a disposition for analytical thinking rather than contextual thinking. Analytical thinking means you basically rely on your reason as an objective faculty that can look at things impartially, rather than contextually, in the sense that most people think in terms of the immediate context that they're surrounded by. They don't think in terms of reaching universal truths and being objective vis-a-vis other people. Only whites have that inclination to reach universal moral concepts, to talk about the equal rights of all individuals, regardless of race and nationality and gender. That's also very peculiar to whites. They have other attributes, such as very low in-group tendencies. Kevin McDonald is very good in elaborating this particular trait, elaborating about it. that whites are less ethnocentric. They're more individualistic. They can have contractual relationships with anonymous strangers. And this is what allows them to create all kinds of civic organizations that are unique to whites. For example, universities. Europeans were unique in creating universities. There were no universities elsewhere. And when you think of universities, even very early on in European history, they were open to everyone. So you would have a university in a particular European city. Well, it was not just for a tribe within that city or for a clan or for a particular religion. It really was, in principle, open to any student from any walk of life. Of course, in those days, Christianity was the official religion, but once you had divisions within Christians with the Reformation, it would come eventually to be open to various Christian sects, and now we know it's open to any religious persuasion or atheists, you name it. So this is a different kind of institution. That's why we call it civic. It's not based on tribal identity. It has rules within it. I mean, the civic organization has certain goals and aims. The same thing with towns. Many towns in Europe became what people call communes. And these are municipal organizations in which people from all walks of life can come in there, regardless of what their background is, and participate and find work. And there were all kinds of legal gradations, but eventually, more or less, as you see liberalism rising, everyone has the same equal rights. And so this is a way in which whites behave. And it was very successful for whites to have civic organizations, because what it means is you can engage in trade, in all kinds of relationship with all kinds of people beyond your locality. And this kind of is also where cosmopolitanism begins to accelerate the notion of a Europe of peoples from all kinds of nationalities interacting with each other. You would have people with a certain skill. If they couldn't find job in France, they go to Italy, and there's a lot of crisscrossing and influencing back and forth between these nations. And we could go on this way, and you'll find many attributes. And even when it comes to everyday details, I have written about the fact that almost if every puzzle that we, or not puzzle, hobbies, puzzles too, by the way, the idea of talking about puzzles and thinking to overcome them is very uniquely white. But also hobbies, almost all hobbies were invented by whites, and most of the games. So this is something that is peculiar to them, and we could keep adding. There is things like concern for animals, for the environment, is very peculiar to them. Reading, that whites read more than other people, read out of pleasure. In other societies, it's very religiously oriented, or just for a practical, technical job. People don't really like to read poetry or novels that much. I mean, again, we're talking in relative terms. It's not as it's either or, but relatively speaking, whites tend to be a more reader-oriented people. They like to create book clubs where they meet anonymous people, anonymous strangers, just gather together. Another thing is the wildlife, or going on hiking, climbing mountains. I mean, I have written about this quite a bit. Whites were the ones who climbed the highest mountains, crossed the biggest, hardest deserts to cross in the world, reached the middle of Antarctica for no reason. The critics of the West would say, oh, they were just interested in resources. It was just imperialism. And you can say that about Hernando Cortés and the Spaniards, that there was a commingling of a spirit of reaching the unknown, of achieving something that no one else has achieved. But at the same time, they were interested in the gold and in money. So it was a commingling of factors. But when you look at Antarctica, why did they go to Antarctica? Some of the men that went right to the middle of it, it was really just at this point what I call a Faustian drive, a sense of doing something that no one else has done and achieving renown for it. And I trace that back to the aristocratic spirit of Indo-Europeans. And it's many things. I mean, the whole earth, all the rivers, the longest ones were traversed by whites and named by them. The highest mountains were climbed by them. They mapped the entire earth, and so on. So I'll leave it at that.
I was going to ask you, Ricardo, about censorship. So as a writer, have you faced any censorship, given your beliefs, your current beliefs?
Oh, yes. I mean, I experienced an academic mobbing, what was it, 3 or 4 years ago, and I had to go for early retirement. I was a full-time professor, and so that was the most obvious one. But before that, once I moved or I started talking about the things we've been talking about, academic journals were just not interested. I used to publish in typical leftist journals when I was younger and I was on the left, and there was no problem. But then the doors began to close, and you lose people that you knew. They're no longer interested in interacting with you, so there is ostracism. You cannot go to a conference and express these viewpoints. In 2006, I think that was sort of around the last time that I went to a typical academic conference. I was shouted at, I mean, hysterically. I just raised a few questions about Islam and things like that. And they become hysterical. They demanded that I leave the room and things like that. Yeah, of course, it's complete and total censorship. There is no diversity of viewpoint in our universities. I mean, you will find it within the scientific, the science-oriented departments, different viewpoints about this particular theory in biology or chemistry. And then within the liberal paradigm, there's a spectrum there, either from very leftist to moderate, middle of the road, but it's all liberal. You'll find some debate within there, but not real debate of the fundamental questions. You're not allowed to question mass immigration, diversity, feminism. You're not allowed to talk about whites, as I was saying before, in a positive way. So yeah, of course, I experienced all kinds of censorship.
I found it very refreshing when you spoke on Red Ice Radio about, how white people are different. And it was very positive. I found it very positive. But I was going to say, about censorship. Can you tell me, did it come as a shock to the system? Because generally, if you're an inquisitive sort of person and you stumble upon things which you deem are true, you want to share it with people and you hope that, they will give you feedback about this. But when they just shut you down, your colleagues, because maybe up until then you thought they were after, they were searching for the truth. They were searching for different perspectives. And when you reach a certain perspective, they cast you out.
Yes. This is, it's a complicated debate as to why it is that in a liberal society, which is supposed to be about freedom of expression, about equal rights, and just liberalism, the word itself, it means you do your own thing, you follow your own lifestyle, you don't do what other people tell you to do. Well, we are learning, or we have already learned, that liberals practice or are responsible for cancel culture, and everybody knows what that means. And so it's something that one has to think about. How is it that this liberalism that emphasizes freedom of speech generated cancel culture. And that could be the topic of another discussion, but I will simply, of another interview, but I will simply say that, and I just finished an article recently, it hasn't been published yet, but liberals believe that you can be tolerant towards any viewpoint so long as someone goes about expressing a viewpoint that aims to create a more collectivist oriented society around, let us say, European identity and nationality. The liberal will not tolerate that viewpoint. Now, you may ask, well, why would the liberal nevertheless tolerate Muslims or Islam, welcome it? Isn't Islam not liberal? Isn't Islam a way of thinking that precludes people from doing their own thing, as Westerners understand that term? I mean, Islamic people are not into gender fluidity. They're not into homosexual marriages. So why is it that liberals tolerate that, but they don't tolerate someone like me? Well, the reason is that liberalism will tolerate Muslims insofar as they keep their religion within their private sphere among themselves. They don't seek to impose Islam as the official religion of, say, England. But the way they perceive someone like me, or any dissident that talks about ethnic nationalism or white nationalism, is that you're not just a group of private people doing your own thing. It's not like you're a metal rock band who does their own thing and is not interested in the public sphere. Now, they know that a white nationalist is aiming for a political goal, is aiming towards the creation of a more collectivist oriented Western state that prioritizes whites insofar as it says we don't need diversity. We must cut all immigration. We must get rid of multiculturalism. So they are not going to tolerate that because that threatens the liberal order. Again, they would not tolerate a Muslim if a Muslim were to say, we're going to advocate that Canada no longer allows women to vote. Their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, that's enough. They're the ones that make that political decision and they vote, and we're not going to allow Muslim women to vote. Well, no, in that case, the liberals would react against that. You could, in the privacy of your home, if you're a Muslim father or a husband, tell your daughters or wife, well, you can't vote. And they're not going to bother with that. But if you declare that as a public, in a public sense, as a policy that you're advocating for, they're not going to tolerate that. And Muslims in that sense have kept, they understand that, and they have gone along with the left because they gain a lot of things from the left. They gain multiculturalism. They gain more immigration, and they get a lot of handouts. So they're okay. Now, eventually, as they gain more and more demographic numbers and more power, they will start pushing for a more Islamic way of thinking. At that point, they will come into conflict with liberalism directly. But in any case, liberalism is a very complicated ideology to understand. And it seems to me now, in a way that I did not fully, adequately comprehend it even a year and a half ago, that you have to understand liberalism to understand what is going on in the West. Before, even in my book, Canada in Decay, which actually became a bestseller at Amazon, although Amazon has suppressed it, and right now they're not selling any new copies and so on, so they stopped selling there. But it was for quite a few years. In that book, I follow the argument that cultural Marxism is to be blamed for what is happening, that there was a march to the institutions. You probably heard that phrase. It's very common among dissidents. Nowadays, I don't accept that. I think that we are living in a liberal order, and that cultural Marxism is just the latest manifestation of liberalism. In any case, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, you've made some very interesting points there. And I'll just go back, you mentioned, we spoke about how, you expect academics, this general perception is that they're open to different ideas, but really they're not. And a few years ago, you would hear lefties, if you ever got chatting to them, and maybe I would say something, I would cast some doubt on the World War II narrative. And some of them would condemn me outright, but then some others, and these are the ones I really didn't trust, they would say to me, what was it they would say? I don't agree with what you say. However, I defend your right to say it. And I always felt, no, the people who would express that should be implied. If they have to express that, I always got the feeling these were the ones who would knife you in the back. You mentioned the forthcoming conflict between Islam and liberalism, and
yes,
that's beginning to happen now, because recently I've seen a few videos. Now I can't give the background. I don't really know. People put up videos and they'll say such and such has happened. But what they were saying was that in some European countries now, the police and the social services have gone to Muslim families' houses and taken the children out of the houses. And some reports, I can't verify them, but they're saying that it's because, the parents didn't want the kids attending LGBT indoctrination classes, So that's the beginning. If that is the case, that is the beginning of this conflict.
yes, it is there. It's latent, and they are conservatives that are becoming. There are some Muslims that are becoming conservative because of that, because they perceive liberals to be going too far. So even though they still, on average, vote for leftist parties, you do see that increasing tension. They don't want their children to be learning about LGBTQ stuff. Now, this will be tolerated. In other words, if Muslims take a kind of conservative attitude towards gay issues and so on, there is still they will be tolerated within the liberal order. They will not be tolerated if they declare publicly, as a matter of a political aim, that homosexuals cannot have the same rights. Then that will not be allowed, because in a liberal society, every individual, no matter what your sexuality, your race, your nationality, has the same worth and the same right. That's why I now repeat often. I do this in Twitter, but I'm going to do it in articles. I already started doing it in articles. What is happening can be explained within the framework of liberalism. See, you cannot have a liberal society and then say that you have something against immigrants from Africa, but not from England, let's say to Canada. It violates a fundamental principle of liberalism for you to judge another person on the basis of their race. So if you're going to have immigration in a liberal society, there are no prejudgments. They could all come from Africa. the complete replacement of German peoples is consistent with the liberal principles of German society. And so in that sense, that's why I concentrate on liberalism instead of talking about some Marxists that are taking over, that are coming from who knows where. And these conservatives like to do that because they don't really want to look into themselves. They don't want to look into their own history and their own culture. And so they also want to keep capitalism safe. So they point to socialism or communism, even though all the major businesses in the Western world support diversity and support mass immigration. They love diverse immigrant places, big highways, and you get all these generic stores, and every town looks like every other town. Just a strip malls after strip malls and fast food restaurants everywhere, and they're all global companies. That's what they love. That's what capitalism thrives on. They don't want some small, quaint Spanish town with deeply rooted families and custom. I mean, they may like it to go there for tourism and vacation and that sort of thing. But capitalism thrives in this anonymous, faceless, generic looking strip mall type towns, not in small little towns with family businesses. They want Walmart, they want Costco, they want Best Buy. That's what they want. That's where the money comes from. And so the conservative doesn't want to face that reality. So that's the reality of capitalism. And capitalism in the West is co-joined together with liberalism. It can't separate one from the other. They emerge together. Liberalism as a very distinctive ideology and a distinctive way of thinking came into full fruition in the 1700s, just as markets, commerce, manufacturing were spreading and taking over European societies. So you can't separate one from the other.
I'm just thinking of, some archaeological site in Europe, and how if a corporation wanted to build, a big massive shopping center on it, they'd come into conflict, with the local people, because the local people are kind of rooted to the area. They go back thousands of years, perhaps. But if you have, a multicultural population, they've only been in the area maybe 2 generations, I don't think they're going to complain as much. In fact, they'll probably be looking forward to having a massive, shopping center in their area, a Dunkin' Donuts, whatever. So definitely this great replacement, from what you've said, it does seem that it's tied to capitalistic greed in a way. And, whites, as you said earlier in this podcast, they're the ones who are most interested in, conserving things, having big national parks, open spaces. That goes against capitalism, because the idea is to build and build and build and build, to conquer nature in a way. You mentioned as well that liberalism. You were saying that eventually, it will come into conflict with Islam. But I noticed something as well, and this was about a week ago, and it kind of, I had to read it twice. I said, no, I must be misreading this. It was an African American. He killed 2 white people or something, but allegedly he said that he wanted to kill white people, and it's being declared a hate crime. And I have, thus far I have, I've never heard of this. It's usually the other way around. So things are changing very, very quickly.
Yes, I don't know about that case. I mean, it may have been a blatant case. There are many. I mean, if you are in Twitter, there's quite a few individuals there who post all these kinds of crimes, beatings, and so on that blacks commit against whites, and nothing happens to them. But there may be, as you mentioned, an instance here and there in which it is so blatant that the Black will be prosecuted. I mean, we still live in a society in which there are laws, and it's true that Antifa and BLM got away with all kinds of illegal activities, and they still do. I mean, you have all this looting going on now, and they get away with it, and they're released from prison very fast. So, but I wouldn't reach a general conclusion from this instance of a Black who committed a racial crime or was accused of having committed a racial crime. I wouldn't make too much of that.
Okay. Before we came on, we mentioned E.O. Wilson, and you said you're aware of his work. Do you know what? Because I think he came under the hammer, as it were. He published a book on sociobiology.
Right.
I think that was the title of the book, Sociobiology.
Yeah.
Do you know what happened there, or why the book was deemed controversial?
Well, he simply brought biology to bear on what the social scientists were saying. As you know, in the Western world, the accepted argument is that nurture, the environment within which you grow, the social environment within which you grow, has a stronger effect on your behavior than biology. So they will acknowledge that biology does have an influence on certain behavioral traits, but in a kind of general way and without any racial distinctions and really without sexual distinctions either. So they argue that fundamentally the main behaviors that you see among peoples in a society are shaped by that society, by how they were raised within the family and so on. So here comes E.O. Wilson with his book Sociobiology, which I think came out in the early 1970s. I have the book, and says no, there are many traits that were selected by nature during the course of evolution, traits which are still palpable, are still part of the genetic code of human beings and are affecting their behavior right now, more so than society is affecting them. So as one of the arguments he made, and I do talk about his book on human nature. In my book, Uniqueness, I have a few pages there about E.O. Wilson and his book on human nature. One of the observations that E.O. Wilson made was that when you look at societies cross-culturally around the world, you find that they have many, that even if the society has people with very different cultures in very different ecological settings at various points in times in history, you find that these diverse societies have many common or universal attributes, such as patriarchy, division of labor, class stratification, other attributes he mentions that they have about marriage and so on. And so he says, well, so how do we explain these universal attributes like stratification and so on? He says, well, they're due to biology. The biology of human beings is very similar across cultures and so on. So this was perceived to be a threat to the liberal notion that society is the agent that shapes people. For liberals are inherently a progressive people. They believe that you can continuously improve society and improve human beings, that you can overcome excessive stratification, overcome patriarchy, overcome aggressive behaviors and differences between men and women, and create a more harmonious society by creating a society that encourages those attributes, those more harmonious, less divisive attributes. That's what they think. So when E.O. Wilson comes along and says, well, maybe not, maybe you can only do so much as far as getting rid of stratification, as far as getting rid of aggressive behavior. Maybe these are rooted in our biology. So that was unacceptable. And to this day, it is unacceptable for, even though, I mean, the amount of genetic knowledge we have now is far greater than at the time when he wrote sociobiology in the early 70s. Still, despite all this new genetic knowledge that we have, to the point that we can point to actual genes as being the origins for this or that particular behavioral trait, the social constructionists are still prevalent in the Western world. Now, I'm not a person who believes that the way to go in our thinking from the dissident right is to emphasize biology. I know there are many people in our circles that's what they think. They think, oh, well, we are the ones who look at science and realistically talk about human behavior, whereas those guys are naive and not scientific. I mean, Edward Dutton is one of them, things along those lines. The crowd associated possibly with V there, with American Renaissance, and so they tend to emphasize biology, whereas I don't agree with this viewpoint, because I think speaking about white traits, one of the distinctive traits that whites have is that they are less determined by biology than other people, which is why they came to emphasize social constructivism so much. And look how far they have gone in reconstructing human beings in all kinds of ways. Now, you may say this is pathological, what they're doing now. They're really going against the limits of nature. And I would agree with this whole transsexual stuff, child grooming, and so on, that they're really acting in a crazy way. But nevertheless, there are many other things that whites have done throughout history in such that it points to they being less determined by biology. And but what I mean by that is what I was referring to before, the research of Joseph Henrich. He shows that throughout history, the values, norms that people had in their heads were grounded in their kinship blood ties, in their extended families. That was the source out of which their beliefs came. Whereas whites broke all those kinship networks, imposed monogamy from above, imposed it, because by nature, men, once they get resources, they go for polygamy. They want more than one wife. That's their nature, that's their biology. But the Catholic Church and Christians prohibited polygamy in the West and saying you can't have more than one wife. You're only going to have one, and monogamy is going to be enforced. So it was enforced in the West, and that itself shows that constructivism is important. Is an attribute of the Western world. And we could go on to pointing to other things. I think, I mean, liberalism itself, which has had such an enormous impact on the Western world, is premised on the idea that we can construct individuals in multiple ways, and they have done that. They have constructed all kinds of things in the West, be they in their very creativity. The creativity of the West in philosophy, in art, is a demonstration that you can construct and create things. Whereas other cultures, their music, their art was more limited. It was kind of more rooted in their tribalism, in their in the world as it was, the European is kind of striving for something higher. It's going upwards. You see it in the Gothic architecture. You're really striving forward, ahead, to escape the limitations of nature, to transcend it and demonstrate that you can do something, because human beings have that potentiality within them, not to be subservient to their biology. So anyways, I'll leave it at that.
I was going to ask you, as we come to the end of this podcast, the current situation in the West, like for example in Spain, the fertility rate last I saw was something like 1.3. I think it's the lowest in Europe, alongside Italy and Germany. I saw statistics coming out about divorce, and Portugal was the highest. I think it was like 85% of marriages end in divorce. Spain was a few percentage points behind. And we see all these things. I see, I'm starting to see lots of videos in different European cities of women twerking, and I don't know, it just seems like it just seems out of place to see this twerking going on in Europe. Just an anecdote, I was speaking to a few women the other week, and like most Spanish women these days, they are of the feminist persuasion, and they were complaining about the machismo here in Spain. They're always complaining about the machismo, and they were saying how bad it is in Spain, the machismo. And I asked them about Islam. Do you not think it's very sexist, and the fact that women can't pray with the men and this type of thing? Would feminists not go there and demonstrate? And these women immediately went silent, because that doesn't fit in with the current liberal paradigm, whatever. And then I asked them about twerking, and I was really interested. I was curious to know what they would say about it, and I presumed they would all give it the green light, because it seems to be promoted now in mainstream media. And that's exactly what happened. They all said it was great, and I said, why is it great? One of them said, it's empowering. It's empowering. And I then said, it's interesting. On Twitter there the other day, I saw a video, and it seems to be the origins of twerking. And I said, in a zoo, in a gorilla enclosure, the female gorilla was in heat, and she started twerking in front of the male. I said, I just thought it was interesting, and I could see they were not impressed with me. They were not impressed. So what solutions do you think could be taken into account, given the current decadence in the West?
Well, it's gonna get worse. It's gonna get really bad. And one of the things that's happening is what you just mentioned. Whites are adopting a lot of Black behaviors. Black behaviors bring us to a primitive state of existence, in which there are less rules, less norms that control your behavior. You cannot have a civilization unless people control many of their biological impulses. That goes back to also a point I was making, that when you're into biological determinism, sometimes you miss this out, that a lot of our social norms are premised on the suppression of biological impulses, one of which is our sexual impulse. If you're gonna have a family that raises children to function properly in a high-tech society, you need monogamy, and you cannot just, because you want to have sex one night or whatever, you simply go with another partner and forget, because that's going to break the family apart. So with this imitation of Black behavior, where we are breaking away from that, in part because liberalism is creating a looser, more fluid, less restrictive societies, what Herbert Marcuse advocated, and in a way capitalism was already moving in that direction, so that the rigidity of the 1950s it was perceived to be no longer necessary because you're creating a more affluent society where consumption is the driving engine of the economy, as opposed to frugality, producing, being careful with the way you use your money so you can save and reinvest and prosper. That mindset gave way to the Keynesian idea that effective demand, consumption, is what drives the economy, and there were lots of consumers. So this created a consumerist mentality, a more laid back, easygoing. This is why people started using the phrase "cool." What is the phrase there? Stay cool, or that's cool. I mean, it was, or easygoing, laid back. Come on, don't worry about it. Be tolerant of this, be tolerant of that. So I think with blacks, this is kind of, their behaviors perceived to be freer in a more kind of physical, low instinct way, where you just unleash those instincts. And twerking also, if you think of dance, ballet, it's very complicated. It requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of suppression of your instincts. To be disciplined to do that is hard. So you're not going to do that. You just twerk, which anybody can do it. It's incredibly easy. It doesn't require much of you. And it's also very sexualized, and it fits in with gender fluidity and fluidity in sexuality and so on. So yeah, I do see that happening in many respects. In the hand movements, facial expressions, particularly among Americans. It's also really spreading in England. Among Americans, the young are really listening to rap music now continuously. They want to be like blacks. Blacks for a long time were perceived to be very cool because they don't seem to get all wind up and stuffy and following this rule and following that. They just walk in a looser way and don't worry about what will happen later. Just spend your money right now and so on. So that whole way of thinking fits in with this later stage of capitalism, as well as the fact that race mixing is a key component in this stage of liberal capitalism with diversity. They don't want to have homogeneous whites that are rooted in smaller towns and traditions. They want a race mixed population that's rootless, mongrelized. They don't know who they are, where they come from, and then companies can easily control them and manipulate them. And so, yeah, you're going to see that increasing imitation of white behavior, of black behaviors.
There's a video, it's been doing the rounds the last couple of years. It involves, perhaps you've seen it, it involves an ambulance in some American city. And obviously, someone has phoned for the ambulance, and the ambulance is trying to get through, but it's blocked by all these blacks, and the women immediately start climbing up on top of it and twerking. So the ambulance is completely stuck. And it's an amazing spectacle, because you have this idea of the ambulance. It's if you look back upon the eons, it's a relatively new idea, a new concept, a vehicle that can move, and that can move to a certain place to save someone's life, possibly. And it's stuck in its tracks because some people just want to dance and they want to shake their booty. It's an amazing spectacle. Dr. Ricardo, this has been a very interesting chat. I recommend people listening share this about, and I will just finally ask you if you have links to your work, which I will put into the description of this video. So where can people find you, Ricardo?
Well, I'm in Twitter. I'm also in Gap. Generally, I sometimes what I post in Gap is what I have in Twitter, but most of the time, no, it's different stuff because you can write longer statements there. So I also have a blog or a website called Euro Canadians. I have that since 2014. We publish articles regularly every 2 days. And then I have 3 books that I have published, and I also have a lot of articles that you can find in ResearchGate. And then also, well, in my blog and in various magazines. Last year, every month, I posted an article in a magazine called Postille about the uniqueness of the West. It was new research about how it is that Western peoples were responsible for all the ideas in cartography, geology, chemistry, art, music, everything. So I have quite a few articles about that in Postille. So yeah.